In late July 2025, the ELCA will hold its next churchwide assembly. One of the assembly's tasks is to vote on constitutional amendments. This assembly gathers every 3 years, and each time amendments to the Constitution are proposed and adopted. That process is nothing new. However, the agenda for the 2025 assembly includes something never seen before in the ELCA. What is it? During the 2022 assembly, those present passed a resolution, quote, to direct the Church Council to establish a commission for a renewed Lutheran church, comprised of leaders of diverse representation from all three expressions, that shall reconsider the statements of purpose for each of the expressions of this church, the principles of its organizational structure, and all matters pertaining thereunto, being particularly attentive to our shared commitment to dismantle racism, and will present its findings and recommendations to the 2025 Churchwide Assembly in preparation for a possible reconstituting convention to be called under the rules for a special meeting of the Churchwide Assembly, end quote. CA 22.01.06. For the average member sitting in the pews of an ELCA congregation, reconstitution might not seem like a big deal. After all, why would they do this? And what could they do? We aren't claiming to have a magic crystal ball to predict the future. What we're going to address in this video is what the ELCA, in its own documents, press releases, reports, and proposals, has made public. And we're going to address the potential impact on congregations and their leaders. The team spearheading this effort is called the Commission for a Renewed Lutheran Church. The committee was established in April of 2023 and met for the first time that July. Obviously, reconstituting is a monumental process. To give a little context, it took nearly 6 years for the formation and writing of the original ELCA Constitution. The co-chair of the current group reported to the ELCA magazine, Living Lutheran, that the new group has been given only a year and a half to do similar work. He lamented that so much time had elapsed already and expressed a sense of urgency. He said, quote, "It's a different environment. You can't take 6 years to make changes anymore in this world," end quote. The weight and pressure felt by the committee is understandable. To restructure the whole governing process for an entire denomination is a formidable assignment. That article reported that, quote, "When the next churchwide assembly convenes in summer 2025, the CRLC will present its findings and recommend whether the church should then mount a special reconstituting convention without delay," end quote. Obviously, there are a number of steps that will need to happen, and it could take less than a year or another 6 years. What's important is what the leaders of the process are saying about what they hope to accomplish with a new constitution, whenever that takes place. To get some insight into what they hope to accomplish, let's start with the word reconstitution. That means literally putting forward an entirely new constitution for the ELCA, not simply amending the current constitution. So, what might the new constitution look like? We can look at the language of the 2022 Assembly Directive for some clues. Let's start with the phrase, three expressions. The ELCA, as a church body, identifies itself as having three expressions, which are churchwide, synods, and congregations. The way these three entities work together is what's at issue when we talk about a shift from congregational autonomy to one of a corporate institutional model. At the center of this conversation is the question, who's in control of your congregation? The congregation itself, or the other institutional structures? Let's look at the next phrase in the resolution. Quote, "The commission shall consider the purpose of each of those expressions," end quote. Recall in the previous video this word purpose. It's a provision that gives the synod authority to put a congregation under synodical administration. And so whoever's in control of defining the purpose of the congregation gets to determine what the congregation does or does not do. To illustrate this, let's use the example of apples and oranges. Let's say your congregation has, for generations, sold apples. But for some reason, the ELCA reconstitutes itself, and without asking, changes the purpose of the congregation to selling oranges. If you decided to keep selling apples, it would seem that this could open up your congregation to criticism from the ELCA, at a minimum. But as we'll talk about, there are other things the ELCA has published and said lately that indicate it could be more than criticism. So what might that look like? Well, remember in the previous video, we identified the problem the ELCA has with enforcing their model constitution onto the local congregation due to the congregational nature of the ELCA. Currently, they don't have any specific authority to impose their broader policies onto local congregations. Another way of saying it is the ELCA is not like the papacy. They can't just make a local parish do something just because they said so. In November of 2023, the ELCA reported that they had hired a law firm to perform an audit of the ELCA's current documents and policies. That audit was done in order to recommend policies and changes to get congregational compliance with ELCA policies. The ELCA attorneys concluded that currently congregations in the ELCA have a level of autonomy that makes it nearly impossible for church-wide policies and decisions to be enforced at the congregational level. Why? Because congregations are highly autonomous under the current constitution. They have no incentive to comply with a policy they don't agree with. To gain greater congregational compliance, the report makes a number of recommendations. Our example of apples and oranges is helpful for understanding a few of these recommendations. The report suggests the ELCA establish a policy which would mandate that congregations purchase goods and services from specific categories of vendors. Think of it this way. If the ELCA wants you to be all about oranges, they may propose a policy requiring that a congregation buy at least 20% of their oranges from specific groups of people. Moreover, it's proposed that leadership in your congregation will need to undergo specific training that will help them conform to the ELCA's new orange selling policy. And this wouldn't just be your paid staff. They propose that all pastors, church staff, and lay leaders be trained by these synod-approved organizations. You're probably thinking, well, this will be hard to enforce. The attorney's report agrees with you as they recommend a, quote, serious discussion of whether ELCA institutional culture should be adjusted, end quote. It goes on to recommend a carrot and stick approach of rewarding congregations who toe the line with more favorable funding terms or more votes at the synod assembly, effectively punishing congregations who don't get in line. This is how the lawyers put it. Quote, policy throughout ELCA institutions should be more coordinated and organized, and should include accountability measures to deter non-compliance, end quote. Let's go back to another key phrase in the 2022 resolution. Quote, the Reconstituting Commission shall reconsider the principles of its organizational structure, end quote. It's helpful to recognize the way the attorney's report and the 2022 resolution are working together and saying the same thing from different perspectives. How so? The ELCA lawyers concluded that the difficulty the ELCA has is that their governance is congregationally oriented. The ELCA isn't hierarchical like the papacy, at least not yet. Their recommended changes to governance structure would create accountability and deter non-compliance with ELCA policies. In a similar vein, a committee of the Reconstitution Commission, called the How Are We Governed Committee, reported on August 9th, 2024, that they have begun a discussion with the full committee on matters relating to, quote, accountability, autonomy versus uniformity, and the need for structural flexibility, end quote. Additionally, they presented draft proposals of possible changes to governance structures. Finally, we're going to focus on the erosion of the pastor's liberty to speak his or her conscience. We can point to a draft social statement on civic life and faith that will be considered at the 2025 Churchwide Assembly. Here's the specific language that's concerning. Quote, when they, meaning rostered leaders, speak on public issues, their words should be rooted in the scriptures and are to be governed by official ELCA teaching, end quote. To be clear, this social statement has not yet been adopted, which means that this language may not be in the final statement. Nevertheless, the fact that this language is even considered in a draft is concerning. You may be wondering, well, can't we just wait to see what happens? Let's think about your favorite football team as an example. When the other team has the ball, you don't know what their next play will be. They may run the ball. And so, to guard against a run, you have a defensive line. But they may pass the ball. And so, to guard against the pass, you may want some defensive backs. If they punt the ball, great, you have the ball. Either way, you've used your autonomy while you still have it. The end result of waiting to see what play they run may find you looking back and seeing that they already have the ball in the end zone. Whether we're talking about congregations or football teams, it's always a good idea to be prepared before it's too late. Thinking ahead and considering what may come next helps ensure your congregation can continue to play on the field. Over the course of these videos, you've heard from real people who've experienced the shift in ELCA governance, policies, and tactics. And you're hearing in this video a little bit about why that might be happening. For now, congregations are still free to comply with or disregard ELCA policies. Congregations still have a choice, but that reality might be changing. So what does that mean for you? You have the freedom to decide. Go to the LCSN website at www.lcsn.us and do your own research. Read the documents, newsletters, and other information we've provided. And if you're concerned, have your attorney contact the LCSN for further conversation. Remember, you are not alone, and there's still time. But the time is now to start taking action.